PSY213 class coming to you recorded from my basement yet again. So this is lecture 11, and what we're going to talk about here is just some other long-term memory phenomena that didn't fit cleanly into any of the other lectures. It's good to sort of build off of recognition. Remember, recognition was one form of episodic memory, that is, memory of things that happen in our own lives. So we're going to talk about some other forms of extensions of episodic memory, if you will, highlighting a couple of key interesting things just to give you, again, a survey of these kinds of memory and how they're tested, that sort of thing. So in this first part, we're going to talk about source memory, and then we'll talk about prospective memory, and in part two, we'll talk about more extensively about autobiographical memory, which is obviously an episodic memory. But source memory, so I've talked about source memory a couple different places in this lecture, and so now it's better to sort of formalize it here. But source memory, it refers to memory for the origin of information. So if you think of recognition as knowing whether something is old or new, source memory is identifying that something is old, but more importantly, identifying where that information came from, right? So, for example, like who told me the forecast is for snow, that is the information, sometimes referred to as item memory in the literature. So the item itself is this piece of information, but who said it? Was it Jarrett or was it Alyssa? That would be the origin of the information or the source of the information. Now, the other thing that sort of connect to this, if you remember when we were talking about recognition and we were talking about recollection, the idea here is that if you can remember the source of the information, it suggests some level of recollection, but you got to be careful here. Even scientists are often sloppy in this particular area, but we can make source judgments based on some inferences without actually recollecting the information. But by and large, it's safe to say that if you remember the source of the information, that you've recollected something about it. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of discriminations that you can make. So prototypically, we could be a source of information. This is called an internal self. And of course, other people or other things like television, media of any kind, could be a source of information. So sometimes you're making a discrimination between things that you've created, you're a source of your own memories, your own thoughts, your own actions, versus an outside source. So for example, did I dream it, or is my wife really mad at me? This would be called, this kind of discrimination would be called reality monitoring, right? If you're trying to make this decision. Did I just make this up, or did this really happen? It's called reality monitoring because if you think about it, this distinguishes our ability to detect the difference between fact and fantasy, our own thoughts or imagination from what really transpired. And if you're sort of thinking, hey, that's kind of interesting, do people who suffer from delusions like schizophrenics, do they suffer problems with reality monitoring? The simple answer is yeah, there's lots of evidence that suggests that they have memory impairments of this type. Another discrimination you could make is between two external sources. So if you're trying to remember whether you saw it or whether you heard it, that would be an example of external source monitoring discrimination. And of course, you could be the source of two different competing memories, and this would be an internal versus internal discrimination. For example, if you're just distinguishing between your thoughts, like did I imagine it, and your actions, did I actually call my wife? In this case, this breakdown would also fall under source discrimination, but it's an internal type of discrimination. So how do we make source discriminations? It's kind of complicated, but the most comprehensive framework that we have is called the source monitoring framework. This has been added onto over the years in many different ways, but I'll boil down just sort of the central points to this theory. And the theory is that this information, the source, is not a detail necessarily that's stored in memory. Instead, it's a judgment based on a couple of things. One is the information or the features that are stored in memory. Obviously, it's memory, so it's based on what you can remember about the original episode, what you can recollect, what you can reactivate. So if we're talking about actually reactivating vivid details, that's going to involve the hippocampus and the left parietal area. Remember our discussion about recollection. If you're remembering vivid details, that's what's going to be involved. Now, there is a smaller case. You could make source judgments based on very weak memories, in which case it wouldn't necessarily involve this, or the memory information that is reactivated is much more weak and lacks critical details. So first it starts with the information that is reactivated, and then we monitor. We use processes to sort of evaluate what is active and make a source judgment. This involves the frontal lobes. So classic examples, like if you're remembering, if you're conjuring up a memory and it has more auditory details, you might think you heard that information versus seeing it. But if you conjure up a memory and it has more visual details, you might think you actually saw the information or witnessed it firsthand. Now, this evaluation is happening in the frontal lobes. And we know this from activation studies, as well as we know from brain damage. So it is possible to have damage to the frontal lobes and have what's called source amnesia. So patients with source amnesia are really good at recognition judgments, just as good as people without damage. However, when it comes to making source judgments, they are much poorer on this source judgment test. So we know that it sort of has these two parts to it. So that's a brief overview of source memory. Let's talk a little bit about prospective memory. Now, prospective memory is a little different because most of our memory, really all the memories that we've been talking about, involve memories of events that were back in time, or what's called retrospective memory. So if you think about it, like right now, you trying to remember something that happened in the past, well, that would be back in time or retrospective memory. So prospective memory, on the other hand, is memory for future events or tasks, right? So you can set up intentions to do things in the future and carry out those intentions. This is what we mean by prospective memory. So some real world prospective memory, going to an appointment on time, deliver a message in the future when you see somebody. These would be examples of real world prospective memories. Now, this has been studied in the lab. Prospective memory lab tests have been studied. It's challenging to study this in the laboratory to simulate these real world tasks, but they've come up with a couple different ways. So one is what one task is something called an event-based prospective memory task. And so you come to the lab, the researchers come to the lab, and they create an ongoing task. Because if you have a prospective memory task, you're going to live your life. You're going to do other sorts of things. And maybe you have to remember that appointment is at 4 o'clock today. Or you have to remember to deliver a message to a friend whenever you see that friend. But you're still doing things. You're not just sitting there not doing anything, waiting for that event to happen. So the researchers often, because they're recruited for a memory study, they create an ongoing task that involves memory. So you read and recall series of words. Again, they don't really care about this. This is just an ongoing task. But then they add a prospective memory task, and they would tell the participants, hey, we want you to press a key on the keyboard, like the F1 key, when you see any word that is an animal word. So they're studying lists of words, and unbeknownst to them, the researchers might put in like 3 animal words, like lion, tiger, whatever. And they come up randomly within the sequence, and the participants are supposed to, when they see the word lion, for example, press the F1 key. This would be an event-based prospective task. They don't know when those particular animal words are going to come up, and when they do, they're supposed to carry out the task and press an F1. And you can determine whether or not, you can measure whether or not they remembered to do the right task or not. A time-based prospective memory task, very similar. Again, some sort of ongoing task like reading and recalling words. But here, the prospective memory task would be based on time. So press the F1 at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes. And you can give them a clock, not give them a clock. You can look at all kinds of features involved with that. But the idea is, do they remember at 5 minutes, the 5-minute mark, to actually do something or press a key? Now, these tests have been used quite a lot in the lab, and they've been criticized for not being natural approximations of prospective memory tasks. So there have been some attempts to look at more naturalistic kinds of tasks. For example, if you think about it, adhering to medication schedules is a natural prospective memory task. For example, if you're on medication, I have to take a pill at, after lunch, at bedtime, whatever the case may be. Do they remember to take the medication according to the schedule. Now, the interesting thing is there is a little bit of overlap here with source memory because you're not going to take your medication if you believed you already took the medication. So that would be a situation where your retrospective memory is wrong, erroneous, you didn't already take it, and influences a prospective memory task. So while there's separate forms of memory, again, keep in mind, like you've heard me say over and over again, these kinds of things interact with one another, and that interaction is actually quite interesting. Now, in the laboratory, some of these naturalistic tasks, they would, again, give participants some sort of task to do, some ongoing task to do, and then they would sort of say, like, hey, at the end of the study, we want you to put the papers away, reset the office materials. They give them other sorts of tasks to do at a later time and just measure whether or not they're doing it. But it's less artificial. It's not like pressing a particular key on a keyboard. A colleague of mine had looked at lab tasks and so like event-based and time-based tasks, and he was testing both young adults, college-age individuals, and older adults from the community to look at aging effects. And as you might imagine, older adults are much worse on these lab-based kinds of tasks. But they also added, on top of this, a naturalistic task. And so when everybody left, they said, hey, we want you to call the lab back at this particular day and time. They set up an appointment for everybody. And as it turns out, the older adults were much better at calling the lab back and fulfilling that prospective memory intention. So it's not the case that aging always results in memory decline. It may depend on the type of task. Now, there's lots of reasons why you might imagine why that might be. Maybe the older adults had less going on in their schedule than the younger adults. Many of them were retired. The young adults were busy taking classes and involved in organizations and things like that. So there's lots of other mediating factors, but the point here is that these lab tasks don't always capture everything that's happening, and it's very important to vary the kinds of tasks that we do. Now, all of this work has sort of pointed to a couple of key things that we know about prospective memory, like how do we actually do this? So the one thing is that once you form an attention, it seems you keep that attention active during the long interval. And it's kind of in the background, but it's a little bit at a heightened activation sort of level. This involves your very extreme frontal lobes to keep these intentions active during whatever interval. And you'll monitor your environment for cues, particularly for event-based tasks. You'll monitor for cues, and when that cue gets detected, perceived, then you sort of execute the tasks. But this still very much remains a mystery, and people are still studying it, but it is a challenging phenomena to study this prospective memory. So in the next video, we're going to talk about autobiographical memory. I'll pick up here.